Welcome to the 53rd episode of Dialogika, a podcast between two friends about the latest in politics, society, and feminism in Indonesia and the world. I'm Stephanie Tangkilisan.
And I'm Sidian Lee.
And this week, I'm back and ready to talk about Indonesian presidential elections. Basically, who's going to run our country in the next 5 years. No big deal.
All of this kind of started with the news of Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, or SBY, former president of Indonesia and leader of the Democratic Party, aligning with good old Prabowo in a coalition against Jokowi, and that's a big deal, in case you don't know.
We're going to be talking about the ramifications of this alliance and what it means to Jokowi's presidential bid, and just kind of the history and drama that revolves around all of these political power brokers, because it's not Indonesian politics if there isn't personal drama involved.
Just want to flag to our listeners, we're recording this episode on Sunday, the 5th of August, so a couple of days before the deadline on the 10th for registration. So take our analysis/conversation with a grain of salt. It might all be wrong, who knows? But we figured we should talk about this because it's gonna be a big deal. Get ready for some hot takes.
So, here's to it.
As some of you may know, or some of you may not know yet, this period right now, from the 4th until the 10th of August, is the period when political parties in Indonesia can start registering their presidential candidate for next year's presidential elections. And obviously, we already know who's going to likely be the candidates, Jokowi and Prabowo. And now, the parties are actually registering and creating coalitions to sign up and get ready for next year.
So the parties have to nominate who they want as the political leaders of Indonesia?
Yes.
Can they change their mind at some point after they choose to side with whomever if they want to change those candidates, or are they set?
They are set. The 10th is the deadline for their tickets, basically, determining who's going to be the presidential candidate as well as their vice presidential partner.
So what's the big surprise in this registration period, or semi-surprise?
What a lot of people have been talking about, it kind of happened out of left wing, is that earlier last week, former President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, or SBY, as we call him, has decided to endorse Prabowo and become part of the Prabowo coalition.
Why is this kind of big news, I guess?
There was rumors that SBY might enter the race, but they definitely did not think that he was going to support Prabowo per se.
There were rumors that he was actually going to side with Jokowi, right?
Exactly. And there were also rumors that he might, endorse his son, Agus Yudhoyono, who was a candidate for the Jakarta gubernatorial election he lost. And so to think that SBY was going to join somebody who, for a long time, felt like an ideological opponent or an ideological opposite is game-changing. And I think even though SBY is not as active in the political scene as, say, like Megawati, he's still a big political voice and he still has a lot of power.
The thing with SBY and Prabowo, in my view, is that they're both giants of the Indonesian political space in terms of influence, and not just in terms of political influence, but also the networks that they both have, the political parties they have, and the fact that they have a lot of money and a lot of people who can help support whoever they choose to have as the nominees for the presidential election. I think a big thing, too, that is somewhat surprising is actually SBY faced Prabowo in the election in 2009 when Megawati and Prabowo actually ran together to try to defeat SBY, and SBY won. One thing to note also is that it's quite likely that Ahaye or Agus Yudhoyono will potentially be the vice presidential candidate because he's younger, he is less tested in the national stage, political stage. So it seems like, in terms of slots, a good compromise for both parties. It just seems somewhat odd in terms of how it looks because SBY's party was, I think, generally a lot more moderate and a lot more liberal than Prabowo's political stances. So it seems like a convenience in terms of what they both want politically. but somehow it does, on a political level, make sense.
Yeah.
In terms of Prabowo not wanting to settle, and SBY has a son who he wants to ascend to some level of power, but may not be ready yet.
For sure.
And in Indonesia, I think ideology is malleable and not a defining line in politics. So in that way.
Yeah.
Hashtag, do you miss Steph's hot takes?
I mean, that's definitely true. And I think, one of the things that not too many people talk about because of the unsavory history is that both SBY and Prabowo are former military generals, and they are very much a part of the long political military history of Indonesia.
Right. They actually used to be really close. They both went to AKMIL, Academy Militer, in the early 70s.
Yeah.
1970, 1973, 74. And they've both been in the military and, rose to the ranks. Prabowo was an elite because he was eventually in-laws with the president of Indonesia / dictator Suharto. And SBY married Ani Yudhoyono, who is Sarwo Edi Wibowo's daughter. He's a big political general as well in Indonesia who was closely allied with Suharto. So they would have probably been in the same circles of political military elites.
Yeah.
It's just that I think they both chose to take their careers a different way, especially post-98. SBY allied with Megawati and became her minister in those early days of cabinet. And Prabowo was ousted from power and had a lot of difficult military scandals, and for quite some time was kind of had a mark against him. And SBY rose to such prominence in 2004, really defeating Megawati by a really large margin, 60 to 39%. And that was sort of a source of a grudge between Megawati against SBY, because Megawati was his boss, essentially, right?
Yeah.
And I think to this day, there's still a huge rift between them because Megawati felt that, SBY was a member of her cabinet. He was creating a new party and soliciting power against her, and she felt she was the rightful heir to the Indonesian throne.
It's like that adage of the grasshopper overcoming and surpassing the master.
So it was a rough one for her. And I think there's a lot of things, if you were an astute political observer, about you can actually never see them if they were in the same event shaking hands, because Megawati avoids him. It's this whole thing.
It is kind of like a reality show drama in terms of the tension between those two.
Yeah.
And actually, when journalists and reporters were talking about SBY joining the Prabowo coalition, he himself admitted that his relationship with Megawati is not great.
But he doesn't have any ill will towards her. It's more like Megawati's
Of course not. But yeah, with Megawati having such a prominent role in the Jokowi coalition, basically running the ship, there was no way there's room in that coalition to include SBY. So I think that's part of what you're talking about, that it's a marriage of political convenience, because how else is SBY going to participate in the elections other than endorsing the other guy, basically?
But so I think what's important to note in the Indonesian political space, for those who is less initiated, a lot of politics is more about personal connections and personal grudges instead of being aligned ideologically. And people have really, really long time ties, decades worth of long ties, that has to be put into the equation when we're talking about politics in Indonesia, because that's the way things are. It can't be understood as a headline in vacuum of what happened decades ago.
And our democracy is so young. These people have ties that are much longer than our democracy, right?
Yeah. So much longer.
That we can't forget.
Yeah.
So I think, as a bit of background for listeners, if you haven't caught up yet, right now, the Jokowi coalition has 9 parties. The usual suspects, PDIP, Golkar, and then some smaller parties such as PSI, Partai Solidaritas Indonesia, which is sort of like the young people party, galvanizing the youth vote. On the other side, Prabowo, with his now with SBY, has 4 parties in his coalition, which is Gerindra, Prabowo's home party, the Democratic Party, the SBY, PKS, Partai Keadilan Sejahtera, or the Prosperous Justice Party, and PAN, Partai Amanat Nasional, or the National Mandate Party. And these 4 parties are sort of like staunchly nationalistic, I would say, in terms of their direction. And certainly with, say, like PAN, they also have political figures and leadership that has been around for a long time, such as Amin Rais and the current Speaker of the MPR, Zulkifli Hasan. And PAN as well is a party that is Islamic-leaning in terms of its ideology. And so we're seeing the Prabowo coalition lean more towards what some members of the coalition have called a nationalist religious ideology and philosophy in terms of how they're presenting themselves, as opposed to, say, like Jokowi's coalition, which is more broad and quote-unquote more moderate and or liberal, even though obviously there are some coalition parties that are not that liberal, but when compared to the Prabowo coalition, it's much more moderate. And I think that will be very significant as we approach the election in this current political climate where, you know, things are still heated after the controversy and all of that, right?
It's yet to be seen what it'll actually end up happening and what political lines will be drawn at this point. If you can be hopeful, it would be that AHY and SBY could have a moderating impact on Gerindra and Prabowo's more hardline responses, and it could kind of shift this dialogue elsewhere. If we've seen how AHY responds to things in the past gubernatorial election, he has not stooped to the level of Anies, etc.
I mean, that's a name we haven't actually brought up yet. You know, there were talks when Anies got the gubernatorial position that this was actually a stepping stone for him in the upcoming presidential elections.
But let's be real, he's like kind of drowning in Jakarta right now. Like
he's not doing well.
His popularity is not doing well.
Not to say that he won't have political ambitions, but I think, you know, the Prabowo coalition is probably
like maybe not.
Maybe next time.
And also, like, they need that extra votes in parliament. They need a bigger coalition. They've tried to do this in the past without, you know, other big parties, and that has failed them.
Yeah.
This could be a way for Prabowo to really come back. I think this is the closest he has been to real political power, back to the way he wants it. And that's kind of scary, honestly.
Yeah, we thought the 2014 election was close.
Right.
This I think, is going to be real close. And in fact, some survey organizations have started doing electability surveys.
What's the survey at?
One of the surveys that was done by the Alvara Research Center, and they did the survey from July 20th to the 28th. They did a national random sampling survey involving over 1,000 people. And their results in terms of electability of a president, Jokowi is 48.4% as opposed to Prabowo's 32.3%, which in the grand scheme of survey results is a really tight race. He's not even past the 50% mark.
And Jokowi has the incumbent advantage, right?
Which also can be a double-edged sword because sometimes, you know, people want to change the incumbent just because they're bored of the incumbent. And that's always going to be a risky, you know, it's interesting how he's going to leverage the fact that he's incumbent. It's
been a long 4.5 years. I can't believe it's been that long in a way.
Yeah.
It feels like longer. And I bet that's what it feels like to a lot of people. There are a lot of problems in not just politics, but economics in Indonesia. SBY had a real incumbent advantage because he oversaw the largest economic growth in Indonesia, I think, that any modern president has faced over the last, in one presidential term. The world markets were doing really well, and under his leadership, there were good market decisions that were made as well. So Indonesia was really in a good place in 2009 in terms of its economy. So when he was supposed to be reelected, it was kind of like he won by a pretty good margin. He won by like 60%, and that was with JK and Megawati like both being in that election. So that's a 3-party race, right? So
for sure.
That's huge. Like, he didn't have to go to round 2 for those elections with 3-party elections. It was just like a resounding victory. So yeah, like it could also be like this is also enough of a time that people miss or people think that things were in SBA were better economically. Maybe he could help the country again in that way. So it could be a smart move on Prabowo's part,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's like a bigger win if we see winners and losers of this outcome. Like I think the biggest winner is Prabowo because there was no way Prabowo could do any better at this moment than being allied with SBY.
Mm-hmm.
SBY is a very strategic, smart player with a lot of political power. So he has a good ally and a good fellow strategist, and it's going to be a really interesting fight with Jokowi.
I mean, you make a good point, right? A lot of people have fond memories of the SBY period, and he was a successful, overall, maybe, two-term president.
He's our only, two-term president post our dictators.
Post our many-term president.
Many-term presidents. Suharto and Sukarno both had over 10 years of democracy.
Yeah, presidential elections weren't really a thing back then.
Yeah, no. So many uncertainty. It's just that it is pretty a done deal that it's SBY and Prabowo now
against Jokowi and Mega.
And it's gonna be this is gonna be like such a tougher battle than just Prabowo before for Jokowi.
And I think a lot of people have been talking about how the Jakarta gubernatorial election is like a microcosm of what might happen next year, right? And we could see that even though Agus has lost, he had a lot of new support that was not going to be voting for aligned with sort of like the Jokowi/Ahok political mindset, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you combine the Agus and Anies support, that is a huge support that hasn't been galvanized, hasn't been woken up to start activating. And when you activate them, that, especially at the grassroots level, I think that could be really dangerous.
It takes time to develop grassroots movements, right? Indonesia is a vast country with such diverse and far and wide islands, right? So it's a lot to take charge of.
And I think, something that should be noted about Indonesia is that the local chapters of these parties are incredibly crucial, because Indonesia is not necessarily a country where everybody's educated.
Yeah.
So a lot of it is influenced by the grassroots movement, by the local political officials mobilizing people. And we can see that with SBY coming in and with the Democratic Party coming in, they have a machine that is equal, if not greater, than, say, like PDIP and Golkar and the other parties on Jokowi's side.
It's going to be doozy. And it's, I think, very hard for Jokowi to find a running mate that will have the same... No, there's no other political running mate that has the same backing as SBY does. Also because Jokowi has alienated a lot of big businesses through their tax policies, which have been pretty strict and fiscally, a lot more punishing for companies. So a lot of political big support that is needed for Indonesian elections, let's just put it that way, is sorely lacking.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's still going to be some level of support because I think a lot of big businesses have to support both sides, but it's not going to be as definitive as it could otherwise be.
And, just like any other kind of political election elsewhere, money talks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can't ignore the big donors, the big corporations, even though I think that the current government, the Jokowi government stance has been much more pro-people.
Mm-hmm.
But pro-people, you got to kind of sort of balance the pro-people versus not alienating, as you said, the corporations and the big funders. I'm not entirely sure if they'll go and embrace SBY and Prabowo completely either, but certainly it's, Jokowi's government is giving them a choice.
Both Jokowi and Prabowo, both sides, as do most politicians in Indonesia, have to do some kind of populist leanings.
Mm-hmm.
Populism is a very big, important rhetoric as part of Indonesian politics. It's just who is the populism for and under what terms, right? For Jokowi, it's definitely more pro rakyat biasa or the ordinary folk, right? And that's done by policies like raising minimum wage and better labor practices and things that could generally hurt businesses. Whereas the populism of Prabowo and Anies have been Islamic populism. So like populism in religious terms, like we've seen in the Jakarta elections. So that's definitely two strands of populism. Like one is almost more democratic socialist and one is more Islamic conservative, like religious conservatism. So
yeah,
that's definitely a thing.
And we definitely cannot underestimate the role of religious conservatism in Indonesia. There are already representatives from the 212 people, back during the Ahok period, the people who were protesting him. And all those like extremist Islamic groups who are saying, we're going to keep the Prabowo coalition in check so that their views and their propositions are going to align with ours if they're going to have our support. And that's not a small thing.
I guess all in all, like what we can say about the situation is that it's gonna be an interesting 2019.
We say this as two Indonesians who are not in Indonesia right now.
Yeah. How do you think this makes you feel in terms of like going back home?
Two things. First is that I really need to register to vote if I am gonna be voting abroad because the vote's gonna matter. And for all listeners, for all Indonesians who are living abroad, register to vote. The deadline is the 14th. Please register, otherwise we're screwed. Secondly, I think...
Are you also talking to me?
I'm talking to you. I'm talking to myself. I'm talking to, all the Indonesians who listen to this podcast who are abroad. I know you exist. Please register to vote. But secondly, I think, we're talking about the presidential elections now in August. We really need to be keeping up with the news. We really need to watch out and keep ourselves informed because if we don't, then our circles and our networks will not be informed as well. And we really need to make sure all Indonesians who can vote are aware of the stakes here because it's not small.
Nope. And with that,
go out and vote. I mean, register. But yes, come in 2019. Also go out and vote.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. You can find more information and resources of whatever we talked about on our website, dialogika.id.
Music credits to John Dealey, Lee Roosevelt, and of course, Broke for Free.
If you like what you hear and want to support us, please review our podcast on the Apple Podcast app or whatever app you use to listen to your podcast. And please share our podcast with your friends. It's the best way to spread the word about Dialogika.
If you want to get more involved, we'd love to hear from you. Our email is dialogikapodcast@gmail.com or just shoot us a message on our Facebook page.
You can also find us on Instagram, YouTube, SoundCloud, and now Twitter. Please follow us on these various platforms. Our Twitter handle is @dialogikapod. Also, follow me on Twitter. It's Steph Tank. That's STEPHTANGK.
Thank you again and see you guys next time.
Bye!